So let's get started. I'll do a quick introduction of myself here later on, but my name is Fredrik Correa, and I'll be talking about flywheel training. And quite new technology for many, so we'll talk about that. Let's see if I can skip here to the next screen. So I'm going to just start with an intro video briefly, just to get the understanding of how a flywheel device works. Okay, I hope you got that video. Oops. Skipping on to the next slide. Yeah, so my name is Fredrik Correa. I'm a founder and CEO of Excentric, which is a Swedish company that produces flywheel devices, but also do education and other things in this area of strength training. My background is I'm an ice hockey coach. And ice hockey player before that, of course, and then today I'm focused on powerlifting myself. I have a bachelor in sports science, studied at the University of Health and Sports Science in Stockholm, and then Karolinska, and then later became a medical doctor and worked for 10 years in the medical industry, and then came back to start Eccentric and focus mainly on, or only on, strength training. So before I move on, I just want to be clear about my biases and be transparent, because I believe in transparency, and we are all biased in some way. So I think the best thing is to be transparent about it, and then people can make the choice how much you want to take from that message. So I am a part of the industry, as I said. And today my reference is obviously our devices, because I work with them and I have more access to the media. So everything you will see, the most things you will see today are of our own brand. There are, of course, other brands. This is a accessibility thing for me. I'm also not a researcher, which is quite common that I get misunderstood. I actually have gotten quite a few requests to do peer review on flywheel articles, even though I'm not a PhD myself. I get asked to do like research collaborations because I post and talk about flywheel science. So I want to be clear that I'm not a researcher. My approach to training and flywheel training is basically I have a physiological interest that I've been studying and been working, and I was involved in science a little bit back in the day. But my main focus is coaching and how to implement and how we can use it and solve the problem that we want to solve with that athlete or that subject we're working with. So I'm not strictly so, and I do read research and talk about research, but I'm not a researcher. So I hope that is clear. So strength training, we have multiple tools, and I think you're familiar with all of these. Most are gravity based, but there are of course other ways to load your muscles and body, like rubber bands and hydraulics. And then of course flywheel, where we use a flywheel as load. So looking into strength training tools in general, I would say that we can have this idea of an ideal tool. Maybe there isn't like an ideal tool for everybody, like all the time. But with a few characteristics, I think it's important for something that you want to scale and use over time and be a big part of your training. I think first of all, it has to be safe, because we can't injure your patients or athletes, or even home users don't have time or they don't want to be injured. It has to be accessible, so easy to understand, easy to use. We need to have it versatile, so we can use it for all types of training. If I want to train to gain muscle mass or strength or power, a versatile tool can hopefully accommodate all of these things. Time efficient, there are a lot of good methods that are maybe a little bit too complicated, requires a lot of time. So we want something that is quite easy to set up and use. It's good if we can quantify, so we know how much what we're doing, so we can see if we progress or make a program basically, and do comparisons. And of course, we wanted to scale, so we can use it for warm-up and training and all through the different training cycles with different athletes, with different strengths, etc. And if we tick all these boxes, I think we have a fairly good strength training tool. So going into Flywheel, let's see if we can tick a few of these boxes. So first of all, Flywheel isn't really new. This is a study from 1924. It's the earliest published paper using a flywheel that I found. So it's a Danish study where they use flywheel as resistance. So it wasn't really a flywheel study that they looked at the flywheel concept itself, but they used the flywheel to look at basically force velocity curves on the bicep flexor. But it's been around before that. It's a well-known concept in mechanics. It's used in like race cars for accumulating energy or storing energy, and as a mechanical concept been used for a really long time. James Watt used a flywheel in his steam engine. That was quite some time ago. So, but in training, quite new. And how it started, so the re-emergence of flywheel in training started in the early 90s with space training because it works in microgravity, that is space, because you're not lifting a load. So a flywheel device will be as much training in space. So that's how it started. And at that point, about 20 years ago, I came in contact with flywheel training in this research. And being a coach, I looked myself into more implementations and adaptations of the devices to look into sort of training on Earth. And that's where I am today, or Eccentric is. So how does it work? So you saw the quick video, and you'll get more videos at the end, so you will get more implementations. So, but basically it's like running in water. So the more, if you're standing still, the water won't do any won't act as a load on you. But if you start moving, the water will resist you. So the faster you try to move in water, the more the water will resist and feel harder and harder. And if you're running full speed, like down into the water, it's almost like running into a wall. But if you would be walking out, you're not hitting that wall, and you can, continue walking out. So, and in this analogy, basically the number of flywheels I put on is basically how deep the water is, and the intensity that I push with is how fast I try to run. So even with a small flywheel, if I go max, it will be high intensity. If I add a lot of flywheels and go max, it will still be high intensity, but much slower. So basically same thing at water. Running max in water, close to the beach, would still be really hard, would be a maximum effort. And if I go out deeper in the water and try to run max, it will still be 100%, but I will just move much slower. So to me, it's quite good. So basically, you are accelerating the flywheel, and the flywheel is resisting you more the more you try to accelerate it. So the harder you pull, the more you accelerate it, and the more resistance you have. You put more rotational energy into the flywheel, and then in the eccentric phase, you will have to absorb that energy. So you will have to absorb the work you put in. In terms of devices, there are, of course, multiple different devices that suit your needs. There are multi-exercise devices, like the one here down to the left. Which is a little bit different, and quite different force velocity profile, but there are quite numerous brands using that, but quite different. The ones that I work with personally are with the straight shaft, with a more typical low speed, high force profile. So the unique characteristics with flywheel is that we have this variable resistance that I explained. So the flywheel is resisting more if I try to go harder. I have an eccentric overload, quite easy to access and get an eccentric overload. Instant feedback, it's quite unique as well, because also it's very practical and easy to use. I would say would be the main characteristics. So going a little bit deeper in those two more physiological ones is the variable resistance. So one thing is like I get max force output through the whole range of motion. Since I don't have a sticking point. if I come down deep into the squat, I'm weaker. So doing a squat with a barbell, I need to have a little bit less weight than if I do a quarter squat. So, because I have a sticking point. With Flywheel, I will be able to generate less force at the bottom, but I will still be pushing max. When I come up higher up into the quarter squat position, I'll be able to push harder, so the Flywheel will resist more. So I get a more of an isokinetic feeling over the whole range of motion. It also means that every repetition can be maximal if I want to go for really high quality work. So say like 3, 4, 5 really maximal repetitions. That would be the graph here to the left, where I have 100% intensity. The first, I will fatigue a little bit to rep 2, 3, 4 gradual. So, but every is with maximal intent and max what I can produce at that time, which is also very difficult to get with weights, because basically you need to take on and off weights, and then you also have the limitations during the repetition, like sticking points, etc. So it's really hard to push maximal all through the range of motion, rep by rep. It also allows for quick changes between exercises, because maybe I don't even have to, change the weight at all going through exercises, and also between users. So make very smooth transitions in training. So, but that's quick about the variable resistance. Yes, eccentric overload. We define it here as is the most orange-red area here. So it's basically loads that are over 1 RM concentric, and quite difficult to get with traditional loading measures, at least in a safe way. With bars, we can use spotters or weight releasers and things, but it's quite complicated, and usually just can do maybe for 1 rep or something, because the transition time from around 1 rep to another is fairly complicated. And it's quite easy. So I'm going to show you some examples here at the end. But basically, if I get more energy into the flywheel, for example, I can use my arms on the way up in a squat and then use my legs on the way down. I have to absorb the energy that my arms also added in on the way up. So that's one easy way to overload the eccentric base, and in a very safe way. Eccentric overload is also very important. We know it translates well into performance, and we work the type of muscle fibers that we look for, maybe even many athletic sort of performance settings, like change of direction, jumping and sprinting. Also builds tolerance for eccentric loads, which is something we're exposed to, whether we like it or not, in many sports. So building tolerance can be really important, both for injury prevention and also putting up with the training. So just a few quick things here on eccentric potential. We know that untrained and also very concentric dominant athletes have a sort of difficulty sort of using their eccentric over. You have an eccentric overcapacity, but it's sort of needs to be unlocked. But here in this graph is just showing, the bottom graph is when they add an electrical stimulation. The top graph is one without electrical stimulation and one with. So you can see instantly in an untrained subject, by adding electrical stimulation, you can unlock this eccentric potential. So there's a neuromuscular factor here that's quite easy to access and get a lot of quick gains in terms of eccentric strength by adding eccentric loads. This is just another study showing the benefits of adding. So I get the argument sometimes that some claim that, but my sport is very concentric, so I don't know why I should train eccentric at all. Maybe I'm a cyclist, or maybe I'm swimming. And and this study is just showing the results of adding. They had the same load in terms of concentric actions, but they had different loads in the eccentric phase. And this is just showing the results on the gains in concentric strength. So you can see the group to the far right, by adding a little bit of eccentric overload in the training period, they gained way more concentric strength. So we have a very good transfer. So I think it's a good argument, even though you have a very concentric dominant sport. I think there's a good argument to add eccentric training anyway. And if you have eccentric actions like change of direction, jump, sprinting, that type of things, definitely. So moving on here. And so we won't go deeper into studies here because we're limited time, but it's looking promising. So you can see that this is the number of published papers over the years. So it's been gradually been sort of on a lower level here until about 2010. And by coincidence, Eccentric popped up here, but it looks really promising. There's a lot of studies now coming out every year, many more research groups. Until 2010, it was basically like 1 or 2 groups looking into this. But now we have a variety of groups with different sort of angles and backgrounds looking into this. So we see much more into different implementations and training your seniors, in-season training, strength training for women, and all types. So it's looking really good. So there's a lot to look into here. So that looks promising, and I'm happy to share if you have specific questions later on, or contact me afterwards. So a little bit about the implementation, so we can see some examples. So going back to the load here, so just we need to select inertia. So we have all these different zones that we can train in. We can train for power, we can train for strength, we can do warm up, we can train technique. So, and all of this is accessible with the Flywheel device if you can change inertia. So basically with a low inertia, going with high intensity, I would be in a power zone. If I from there add inertia, it would slow me down and it would put me in a strength zone. For overload training, going with higher intensities and more inertia gives more overload. So that's basically the fundamentals with loading. And here I'm going to just show you an example of this is how it could look like the first time you're on a Flywheel device. As you can see how it's sort of fairly safe and easy it is.
So I'm retracting a little bit of dry belt here. Good. You decide for yourself how deep and how hard you want to go. And with a too small flywheel, this is repetition again, but with a too small flywheel, it would be quite easy for her to just go up too fast and lose control and being pulled down very fast. The transition between the concentric and the eccentric action will be much shorter then. So I think this is a good. And then when she wants to stop, just want you to absorb on the way down and stop. Now we can stop and disconnect here, or you can go up slowly.
So that is, now you saw the usage a little bit.
So I'm retracting a little bit of dry belt here.
So if I can move on to the next slide. Okay, good. So now you saw it in use a little bit. So that was a sort of first time user basically showing that. So with the Flywheel training, we have a wide loading spectrum. So I'd say that it can be a very versatile tool. So we have the concentric actions that you saw. We have the eccentric actions. And you can also do isometrics. And I'm going to show you examples. And when it comes to eccentric overload, we can do both targeted for specific angles, or we can do a general overload over the whole range of motion. We can have also work in lateral movements, which is quite difficult with weight loading options. And we can also unload portions of range of motion. Basically, if I don't push through certain angles, I won't be loaded, except my body weight. So it's easy to unload parts if you are, for example, restrictions in terms of pain or anything. So a few more examples. Here's some overload. So you can see here that, like I explained before, he's using his arms on the way up, and he needs to absorb that with his legs. So he's working over an overload over the whole eccentric range of motion, adding energy that is forced to absorb. In the next example, he's going to do it more targeted. So he will be absorbing fast at a sort of specific angle to overload that angle. So he's sitting down and absorbing hard. So he has to absorb the same amount of energy as he produces, but in a shorter period of time, because he's just contracting in a very sort of around a few angles here in the eccentric load. So it's targeting that angle. So it's very easy to get an overload. Or you can strengthen maybe if you have a starting position or a sprinting position or jumping position. And you can work that angle. impulse. So basically he's sitting down and taking it everything as a hit. So this will be, for example, be a landing, and this is used by, for example, we have Olympic snowboarders using this a lot, because when they're able to land harder, they're also able to have more velocity into the jump. And if they have more velocity into jump, they can do more tricks and score more points. So landings, the strength in landings is critical for them to score points, basically.
Fredrik, har du mye igjen?
Ja, it's not klar. Soon. So just a few isometrics. Now it. So that was two examples of isometrics using both the machine as a resistance, setting an angle, and also having a coach so you can switch between eccentric and then into concentric actions. So, and then of course, by different types of load and implementation, we can train for gaining muscle mass, strength, power, and also do like sport-specific actions, like we saw a few examples of, or at least more specific. So we're just mixing with the inertia and the training load, the quality of training, the intensity. We can hit all these different areas in training. We can train remote. Most devices are quite easy to bring with you because you don't have to carry around the actual weight, which is good for many sports that don't have maybe access to gyms all through the season or in-season training.
Fredrik, jeg tror jeg må stoppe deg der. Tida dessverre ute, og vi har en ny gruppe som skal fremføre, dessverre.
Yeah, perfectly okay. I'm basically done, so I think we ticked a lot of boxes here, and that's it.